And I go off and make a huge mistake, and they're disappointed.
And they can't forgive you.
In Anchorage, you're one of 15.
Mm-hmm.
In Ketchikan, you're it. Everybody knows you. Everybody goes to the same grocery store. And it was difficult. My parents were confronted at the store buying bread, people yelling at my mom. My kid's teacher would start every Friday with current events and take out the newspaper, and who's on the front page every day down in Ketchikan is me. And he would discuss me in front of my child. And I pick my daughter up and she's teary. And that was the tough part. I can take it. But it was hard to see people that I loved go through things like that.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is former Alaska State House Representative Kyle Johansen. Kyle was elected to represent his hometown of Ketchikan in 2006. 2 years later, he became the majority leader in the Republican-led House. After being reelected as majority leader, he left that caucus in protest of a committee leadership decision, which he now sees as a huge mistake. A mistake he continued to pay for years afterwards, ultimately driving him in 2019 to relocate to Hawaii. In the 34th Legislature, which starts this January, Kyle Johansen will be returning to Alaska as staff in my office in Juneau. Today, we learn his story. Kyle Johansen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Were you born in Ketchikan?
I was, yeah. I was born and raised in Ketchikan and went to Ketchikan High School. Go Kings.
What was growing up in Ketchikan like?
It's a wonderful place to grow up. My kids, all three of them, still live there. All the things you would imagine, hunting, fishing, but being on an island in a small town, it's almost like Andy Griffith's show. Everybody looks out for everybody, especially being on the water. You know, it's dangerous. And in those days, in the 70s, we had the logging industry going 100 miles an hour. We had fishing going crazy. And that's oil and water in politics. So lots of transplants in their 20s with pockets full of hundreds and more bars than churches. It was a crazy place. Very colorful, but really great place to grow up.
You left Ketchikan to go to college? Like right after?
I did. I went to Washington State University and got my degree in elementary education, and then came right back to Ketchikan.
And did you work as a teacher?
I did not. I was a sub for a couple of years. I had a good job in the summer. Most of the work in Ketchikan is seasonal, unless it's government work in those days. As I was being a substitute, I felt like I wasn't really mature enough to take control of these kids' lives. That was just my own feeling. And that was the point. I was living with Steve Williams and Bill Bowling, two people my age in Ketchikan. And Steve's dad is Bill Williams, the former representative who's passed on now. And Steve was working on his campaign. And he'd come home every day, right in the middle of the ball game, and complain and vent on all of the horrible things that had happened in the politics in the campaign. And I just kept telling him to just shut up. I'm trying to watch the game. And he said, I will be quiet if you come and help me tomorrow. And so that kind of segued into, that's how I got started in politics, was being annoyed at my roommate.
You went to work on the campaign the next day to assuage your roommate, and you ended up working for Bill Williams, right?
Yeah, this was in early October 1994. And Bill had just won his initial election by 8 votes. So this was the first re-election campaign for him. And that's very challenging, the first go around to defend your seat. And after about 3 weeks of being in his campaign office, he pulled me aside and said, listen, if I win, I want to offer you a job because I want a full Ketchikan staff in the office. So, of course, I was like, sure, because I loved it from the very beginning. It just felt good, creative, doing campaign ads, writing, things that I really enjoy doing. And politics have been a part of my life all the way back to my dad worked on the Marine Highway for years and worked in the union there as well. So because of that, we could use the ferry system to go down to Seattle. My mom's mom and stepdad lived in Milton, which is between Seattle and Tacoma, just above Fife there for people familiar with I-5. And she was a Democrat from Kansas. She was part of the group in the Depression that moved to Oregon and eventually up to Seattle. My grandpa was an immigrant from Norway. He grew up above the Arctic Circle, 100% subsistence lifestyle in an isolated fishing village. And he was a Republican. And as a joke, we'd always go up and see Grandpa before we got on the ferry. I didn't know any better. I was 4, 5, 6 years old. He would tell me something to tell Grandma, like, Nixon's the best. And I just went to Grandma and said, hey, Grandpa said Nixon's the best. And she would look at me and scowl. And then the last day I would leave Seattle, she would give me a message about Jimmy Carter or somebody else, and I would deliver that to Grandpa. So they played this game with me for a long time. And on hindsight, I can see how they were having fun with politics. And then in 6th grade, we did an up-close trip to Juneau, which was really amazing for me. And all I really remember about that is meeting Jay Hammond, because he was on TV every weekend on public television, almost like a fireside chat on what was then called a RATNet, Rural Alaska Television Network, which basically public radio, right? But to an 8-year-old, anything with a rat in it is, exciting. And so we used to watch the end of Jay Hammond's fireside chats waiting for Rocky and Bullwinkle to come on. And he was a legend, of course. And I remember being on the 3rd floor conference room, sitting at that gigantic, impossibly large table, not realizing it was like 8 sections put together. We all thought it was one giant piece of wood. And Governor Hammond came out with his characteristic style, and we were in awe. This is the guy we saw on television. He was funny. He looked like Santa Claus a little bit. So when I got an actual taste of politics and campaigning, it just felt perfect, like I'd supposed to be doing that. And then I worked for Bill for 6 years.
Tell us about the 6 years that you worked for Bill as a staffer.
I started off on the front desk as the, low person on the totem pole, or the first contact with all the public. And the first day of session, Bill walked in and put a bill on my desk and introduced me to Kent Dawson and Sam Keto and said, this is a bill I want to do. These guys are here to help you learn the system, along with Pete Eklund, who was the other staff member. And so from the very beginning, it was like, here's responsibility, learn how to do it, listen to other people who've done it. And he had faith. He was that type of guy. He believed you could do things and gave you a lot of confidence just by the way he handled himself. And it was a great experience. The next session, when he was reelected again, we moved up to the 4th floor. I just listened to Liesel's podcast. And
Liesel McGuire, former senator, former House member.
And that was the time when they had a supermajority. And they were doing the marriage constitutional amendment in 98. That was a great experience, too. In that office, just across the hallway, were Scott Kawasaki and Joe Hayes. 2 doors down was an intern named Mary Sattler, who ends up being Mary Altola. So it was a great place for young minds and an incredible experience. And then also seeing how that supermajority would push and cajole and literally threaten and bully some of their members. Bill's Alaska Native, a Democrat in this caucus. They needed him to get to supermajority status.
Bill Williams was an Alaska Native Democrat representing Ketchikan.
Yeah, he's from Saxman, which is inside the Ketchikan borough, but the district was Ketchikan, Prince of Wales, Saxman, yeah. So, you saw a lot of different dynamics. Subsistence was the issue of the day. And Thankfully, it hasn't been back in the building for a long time because that is ugly. It was a really difficult time for all the legislators, but especially the rural legislators. But the next year, he ended up on finance. And so I got a taste of running finance committee subcommittees, budget subcommittees, which was really interesting. The big thing that we did that I'm most proud of working for Bill was doing constitutional amendment on initiatives, which is the last constitutional amendment to pass. And we came up with that idea in the summertime, reading about something that was happening in, I think it was Montana or North Dakota. And I brought it to Bill and I said, hey, what do you think about this? And he said, that looks pretty good. Let's do that. And it took 6 years. Well, I was long gone by the time it got on the ballot to be voted on by the people. Before, you could gather all your signatures at the mall on Fifth Avenue, all of them.
Oh, so I assume that amendment to the Constitution sort of spelled out how many signatures you needed and from where they had to come from. Like it
used to be you needed one registered voter in 27 districts, one single person. And then you could go for the ultimate goal. And what happened was Bob Penny, who's now passed on, no offense to Bob, but he was pushing something called the Fish Initiative, which would prioritize sport allocation over commercial. And of course, Ketchikan's a commercial fishing town. He made the mistake when talking to Bill to say, Bill, I don't care what you do. I can just go get all my signatures in Anchorage and you can't stop it. And it was a real difficult attitude. And Bill didn't like to get bullied and it bothered him. And so when I brought that proposal to him, said, hey, look at this, we can change the Constitution. The people who wanted to shove things down the rest of Alaska's throat had nothing stopping them. And so now you have to get 10% from 27 districts of the number that voted last time. And it went on the ballot. There was not really much of a push either way. Very little money was ever spent, yes or no. And there was no social media. There was none of that stuff going on. And it passed 52-48 or something. And it's been like that ever since. But in hindsight, that was a huge change. Imagine right now if you could put anything on the ballot sitting at the mall. You didn't have to.
No, I mean, I can see that's extremely helpful. I'm really glad you guys did that. Just thinking about with ballot measure 2 failing very narrowly and the people wanting to repeal ranked choice voting saying, oh, we'll just do it again in 2 years. If they could just get all their signatures in the Matsu, for example, they'd already have, they'd be done now. They'd be done now.
You can do it in a week.
Yeah. So it makes the difference.
Yeah.
So you left his office after 6 years, and then there's a gap before you ran for office. What'd you do in that gap?
In 1999, my wife at the time got pregnant for the first time. That's why I left Bill's office. My daughter was born in February of 2000. So in 99, I was like, either I go back to Juneau and I leave my pregnant wife. And I said, I'm going to be Mr. Mom. So I was in Ketchikan. My wife, she was an accountant. She was working for a company down there. And I was Mr. Mom for 2 years, which was one of the greatest experiences, obviously, of my life and challenging. Like anybody who says a stay-at-home mom has it easy is insane. It is a challenge, taking care of a human being. You can't dismiss that. And so that changed my perspective on a lot of things. And then the lobbyist for the Ketchikan borough, the city of Ketchikan, the school district, and we have a public utility, so it's a four-headed monster, was indicted for stealing money from Russians to start a fish company in Ketchikan. And he went to prison. And now all of a sudden, the city and the borough are looking to hire somebody from Anchorage, no offense, or the Matsu. Those were the finalists. And I was like, JC's going fine. She's 2 now. We have great daycare. I'm going to try and get this job. So I lobbied the city and borough, got the votes, and I was lobbyist for those four entities for 4 years. And then Bill got tired of it. He'd been there for 12 years. He'd actually filed for the Senate. This is when Robin Taylor resigned and Bert Stedman was appointed by Murkowski.
Governor Frank Murkowski.
And Bill had filed to run for the Senate seat. And the polling numbers, there's no way. Bert had zero chance to beat Bill. But Bill decided he didn't want to do it anymore. His last session was very difficult. He was co-chair of finance. And he was just burned out. And he decided not to run. And it was a good choice for him personally. But first, Murkowski appointed Jim Elkins to the Senate. And the next day, Elkins came out on the front page and criticized Murkowski over the longevity bonus, which he canceled famously and bought a jet. Murkowski pulled the nomination and said, "You're not getting it now." And so Jim ran for the open house seat and won. And so I was a lobbyist for 2 years, watching Jim operate in the House. I never thought about running. And not to speak ill of Jim, but he just was not getting the job done. It was obvious. The highlight of the day was getting the lounge menu faxed to the office. And my kids are down there. My family lives there. I live there. My friends live down in Ketchikan, and we're getting shortchanged.
Did you have 2 more kids while you were a lobbyist? Did you have 3?
Yeah, I had twins by then.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, 2004. My wife and I had twins. So I've got my kids and all my friends and the whole community that I love is not getting represented very well. And I just decided I can do something about this. And I ran. And people thought I was crazy because as a staff member and as a lobbyist, especially as a staff member, my job was to keep my mouth shut and answer to my boss. I wasn't out there talking to the press. I wasn't out there pushing things publicly. That's his job. And I had people come up to me and say, "You have to speak up at this job. Are you sure you can do it?" I'm like, "Yeah, don't worry."
So Elkins in the primary, or how did that work out?
That's a whole story unto itself. See, Jim owned a bar in Ketchikan through the 70s, and he catered to the loggers and the fishermen and the resource industry. He was also extremely active in politics. And so this is the days of Ted, Frank, and Don as the triumvirate, and those three just ruled the day. And in those days, Southeast, we had 6 representatives in those days. And so those guys came to Southeast for money and political power and support in the legislature. It's not like it is today. And Frank went to Ketchikan High School. He graduated from K-High. And Ted Stevens was always very connected to Ketchikan. But that all goes back to the timber industry, Louisiana Pacific, big contributions. It's all tied in. Jim was one of the local guys that stirred up the support for the delegation, very active politically. And he was on the Borough Assembly and things like that. So he was well known, supported by the delegation, and he was elected pretty easily to replace Bill. And then that's when Murkowski was trying to change the oil production tax. This is when all the VICO stuff was going down.
The VICO scandal involved Alaska state legislators taking bribes related to oil policy. I have discussed this issue pretty in depth with former Representative Sharice Millett and former Representative Cliff Groh. I will drop links to those 2 episodes in the show notes.
And so when I filed, I made it public at midnight on adjournment day in the Capitol as a lobbyist. As soon as they adjourned, I went up and talked to Jim and told him I was going to run against him. I thought that was the right thing to do. And he told me to get the F out of his office. He was mad, but I thought it was the respectful thing to do, so he didn't hear it from anybody else. During that summer, there were special sessions trying to pass Murkowski's production tax, and Murkowski has a shiny new jet. So Jim was flown down from session multiple times on Murkowski's jet. Frank would come up with some reason to come to Ketchikan. He owns a bank there, right? So he would come down and there'd be a banquet. And so he would hop on the jet and fly down. Jim, you want to ride? On those days, you didn't have to disclose all that stuff. So Elkins would show up almost every weekend. You could see the jet parked over at the airport. And Don Young was taking out full-page ads in support of Jim. And now Ted Stevens, to his credit, I had met him years earlier working for Bill, and we hit it off for some reason, and he stayed out of it. But the sitting governor and the popular Don Young, very popular in Ketchikan, were forcefully campaigning on Jim's behalf. And it was a primary only. No Democrats ran, so we fought it out in August. In June, a poll came out. He had 45%. I had 35% and 20% undecided. And the election ended up 55-45.
For you.
He picked up 0 undecided people.
How did you do it?
I wasn't mean. I didn't have a history of pissing people off. And I had Bill Williams in my corner. He was an incredibly popular person in Ketchikan. He was a Democrat in a Republican town, winning consistently because he was real and he didn't sugarcoat anything. That was one of the great lessons he taught me, is tell people the actual situation. Even if it's horrible, they will appreciate knowing exactly what's happening. Don't sugarcoat it for them. They can figure it out. Tell them what's actually happening. Their chances are 5%. Tell them that. Don't get their hopes up.
Mm-hmm.
And people really responded to that. And Steve, his son, an incredible campaign manager. I don't think he's ever lost a campaign. And everybody knew my dad, and my mom's a teacher. She taught hundreds of constituents. She was a kindergarten teacher and one of the most beloved teachers in town. So I had tons of support. And I think the key was Jim had defined himself so harshly over 2 decades of being a tough businessman.
So what was your first term like?
Because I'd been in the building.
And you got elected in 2006?
Yeah.
Started in 2007. So Palin was governor. Palin was elected at the same time as you.
Yes. Sarah and I were elected on the same ballot. And so, yeah, I'd been in the building for 10 years as a staffer and as a lobbyist. And so I had a lot of confidence. I knew how everything worked. I knew who everybody was. You pick up so much from different perspectives, listening to other lobbyists behind closed doors, listening to other staffers and understanding all that stuff. So when I came in as a legislator, I had a toolkit that nobody else had. And obviously that was extremely helpful. And so I chaired transportation my first 2 years, which was a great experience. And so it was really good. I had a lot of support from John Harris, was our speaker at the time. And he supported me quite well. And so it was great. Yeah. And I had a great staff. I had Randy Ruaro was my chief of staff. Sonia Christensen, who's a lobbyist now, was my front desk. And Dave Scott, who works up at Stedman's office, was my middleman. And so that's a heck of a staff.
Oh, yeah. No, that's amazing. I don't know the actual chronology of when you became the majority leader.
That was my second term, was as majority leader. And that was incredible. That was such an experience. And that's honestly in caucus, that's where my classroom management training from elementary education came in. We had a real strong group, and it was a bipartisan group. We had Richard Foster and Bob Herron and some of the other Bush folks in on that. But it was incredible. It was an honor to be the majority leader and to be the speaker pro tem. And Chenault, he did a good job as speaker. We worked well together. And that's where the second part of my interest in initiatives came out, where just prior to that, there was Pebble Mine initiative going on to ban the Pebble Mine forever. And Bob Gillum, who is now passed on, owned the lodge up on Lake Iliamna. I don't know if you're familiar with Gillum, but he ran McKinley Capital. He was the richest man in Alaska, and billionaire, and active in politics, of course, and very close with Ted Stevens. And what he did during that initiative, there were no disclosure laws for the signature gathering period. He could do whatever he wanted to. And he owned a couple jets. And he would send his jet to California, hire a bunch of signature gatherers. And then he had a couple bush planes. He would fly them up and put them in smaller planes and fly out to villages. He spent millions, and we all knew about it, but none of it had to be disclosed. So it was just a free-for-all. And so I introduced a bill to extend the reporting period back to when you first file an initiative. Now you have to disclose everything. And he did not like that because he was the main example. I used his name in committee all the time. And he did not like that. And in fact, one of my lobbyist friends came up to me one day and he said, "Wow, you made the list." I said, "What list?" He goes, "Bob makes a list of legislators he wants to get rid of, and you're right near the top, buddy." And so now I got the richest man in Alaska not happy with me. And that's part of the next chapter because, before we get onto that, those 2 years were incredible. We literally forward funded education. We wrote a check for 2 years while I was majority leader, which was something the education community had been trying to do forever. And we did that. Oil was outstanding. Price-wise, we also paid back the Constitutional Budget Reserve 100%. That's the $16 billion the state's been living on for the last decade, is the money that we intentionally deposited back into the CBR. And we had huge capital budgets. You can only pump so much money into the economy every year. You put $16 billion into the economy over 2 years and it overheats. There's too much going on. Outside companies were coming into Alaska, the lobbyists that we would have. We had remember The Big Short, the movie? I don't know if yeah. Banks were taking us out to dinner, begging to get a hold of some of those billions to stick in those tranches into those investments that was outlined in that movie, The Big Short.
Just to be clear, you guys had so much money for a couple of reasons, but one of them was ACES, right? So the Palin tax restructure was bringing in tons more money.
Yeah, it was Murkowski's structure at first, and then we moved on to ACES. But the price of oil was really what it was. $120, $130 barrel oil. There was money everywhere. And everybody wants that back. Of course we do. When you're in that situation, everything comes out of the woodwork to try and get their hands on it. We were playing defense by sticking that money into the CBR. We also appropriated billions into the principal of the permanent fund above and beyond. We had, I think, a $2 billion, a couple times, $2 billion transfers straight into the corpus just to get it off the table. So it wouldn't be there for, God, somehow we accidentally, air quotes, give this to a bunch of Wall Street guys who are going to invest in this scam for real estate. We all know the story of the real estate deal, but all sorts of things like that. Everything came out of the woodwork. Every project you could imagine in Alaska, people had a great story for it. But we did a lot of good things. So it was a pretty incredible experience.
So the richest man in Alaska has it out for you. And that's laying the foundation for the next chapter.
A lot of things happened between my second session and the third session where I found myself out of the caucus.
The reporting is that another member of the caucus wanted a particular position, a chairmanship. She didn't get it, and you left the caucus with her in protest.
Yes, that is exactly right. And I made mistakes. I take full responsibility for my actions. I know what I did. And it was not the right thing to do. I know that now. But based on things that happened in the past, because people have left the caucus dozens of times. And 3 or 4 weeks later, they're back in. They're in a smaller committee. They have to start over again. And that was my calculus, is what I thought would happen. Well, and
you were the majority leader stepping away. And I guess and I don't remember what chair she didn't get, but
legislative budget and audit.
LB&A. So
right in the middle of all this oil tax credits and all of this oil regime that was new and complicated and controversial.
Right. So were there certain people, I guess, like powerful forces, that they had already decided who they wanted to be on LB&A? And was there like a pressure to not have her on LB&A?
That's the timeliness of it. At the time, the ability to have a budget and to hire consultants to dive into this new oil and gas regime was hot. And so, in a nutshell, what happened was she had secured the votes with the caucus. We were at Big Lake, and we elected the speaker, myself, rules chair, the 2 finance people, and then we went to LB&A. And as majority leader, I was counting the votes in the back of the room. People would write down who they wanted where. She had secured the votes, and when they took the secret ballot, she had lost. So she was crossed by members of the caucus right there. People lied and said, "I support you." She added up the numbers, and she told me, like every other member told me, like the resource or the finance chair said, "Hey, I've got my votes. I'm good." That's what everybody does when you're organizing.
Right.
You did the same thing. I got my votes, because you got to make sure.
I was going to say for listeners, she's been on the podcast and she's told this whole story herself. So we're talking about Pretty Smollett. So it's not like I felt like we're not saying her name. But
no, it's no secret.
Smollett, she tells the exact same story on her podcast episode from earlier this year.
Yeah, no, it's no secret. Yeah. And so 2 things that happened. One is I was already elected majority leader for the second time. Okay. And so now I've got a caucus where people are telling people one thing and basically lying about it. And the person that wanted it was Mike Hawker, and he got it. And there's more to that story. It's a little personal with Mike, and I don't really want to get into that.
You don't have to, and Charisse does, so people could go listen to it there.
Yeah, for sure. But leading up to that organization, several things happened. One was, while I was majority leader, one of the responsibilities is to sit down with the Republican Party and figure out who gets campaign money out of the House Leadership Fund. So I would fly up to Anchorage. Chenault would fly up from the Kenai, and we'd meet with the co-chairs, Stoltz, and John Coghill would come down from Fairbanks. And we would make decisions about who got campaign money. And we would organize fundraisers. And so I had access to all of this information and the numbers. I had a lot of questions to Randy Riedrich, the chair of the Republican Party, and he doesn't like to be questioned. And I'm a bulldog, and I'm like, explain to me where this money went. Randy was never a fan from the time I ran against Elkins. Elkins was one of Randy's guys. And so he was never too thrilled with me. They hated Bill Williams because he was a Democrat. And the Democrat Party didn't like Bill because he caucused with Republicans. He was truly independent, even though he was a blue dog Democrat. He was like Liesel. I just listened to Liesel's, and she registered as a Republican because her dad was Republican. Mm-hmm. Same thing with Bill. And so none of the parties liked Bill whatsoever. And so Randy was never too happy with me in the first place. And then I started poking around the finances of the Republican Party, and he really didn't like that. And then once I passed the initiative disclosure bill, I started putting together a complete rewrite of APOC, a massive undertaking. I had my staff working on it, getting draft bills, doing the groundwork for it, having conferences with APOC, and of course, word gets out. And so now I'm going after APOC, and nobody in any party wants me to go after APOC. And then the big one was when Lisa Murkowski lost her primary to Joe Miller. Full page ads with all of us supporting Lisa during the primary, the speaker, myself, rules chairman, both sides, Senate, House, in every paper in the state. You've got our faces and our names and our titles. We support Lisa. And Joe wins. And every one of those people dropped off the face of the earth for Lisa. And she called around to all of us personally, look, will you support me? Will you support me? And I said yes. And I was in ads for her. And the people in Ketchikan went bananas because they love Joe Miller. On national politics, they are very conservative. Local politics, it's all about the person. But they're hard over for Trump. They were hard over for Bush, and they loved Joe Miller. A lot of Tea Party was called the Tea Party back then. Mm-hmm. And I had people come to my office and scream at me, chew me out. And letters to the editor where this guy, who does he think he is, supporting Lisa Murkowski? She's a rhino and blah, blah, blah. But I told her I supported you from the beginning and I'll support you all the way through. And I did. And a lot of people in Ketchikan were pissed at that before any of this organization went. This is August through election day that all this is happening. Add up a lot of those things. And then I make a big, huge mistake. And everybody who's pissed is, yeah, there you go.
I mistake it like by leaving the caucus?
Yeah, I never should have literally left the caucus. But again, my calculus was knowing that people had left the caucus before, and within a couple of weeks, they were invited back in.
What my understanding was that the caucus was 27 at the time. What I've heard is if the caucus had been smaller, you probably would have been asked back a few weeks later, but they just didn't need the number.
Yeah, and that was the thing personally that really took a long time, and I mean years, for me to get over, because a lot of these people were people that I had been in the trenches with and helped immensely. Like, we got a bunch of stimulus money that year. I don't know if you remember the stimulus free money because of the economy.
Yeah.
And so
following the housing crisis or
yeah. And so the far right Valley folks, you know, the Tea Party people were like, don't take that money. Sarah got a lot of pushback for even accepting the money that the feds were given. I had representatives in my majority leader office literally in tears because they wanted the money for projects, but they thought they were going to get beat. And, you know, so you go out on a limb for those people and you help them and you support them and you give them ideas to deal with your constituency, or you talk to key people in their district and try and explain to them what's going on. You do all that sort of stuff to support your caucus. And some people that I've known since I was staffers. I was roommates with Bill Stoltz when we were staffers together. So that's what I was relying on. That was my calculus, is they can beat up on me. They can get all the press in the world for policing me and putting me back in my place. But eventually I felt like they're going to come around and they're going to say, all right, Kyle, you can come back in. You can be co-chair of this special committee and you're going to pay your dues. Literally, that's what happened to Charisse.
She came back and became the majority leader.
But she had to wait. She didn't get it immediately. She sat there and co-chaired a committee for 2 years, and she did all the groundwork that she should have done. But I didn't get a chance to come back. And part of that is the differences in the districts. In Anchorage, you're one of 15. Mm-hmm. In Ketchikan, you're it. Everybody knows you. Everybody goes to the same grocery store. And it was difficult. My parents were confronted at the store buying bread, people yelling at my mom. My kids' teacher.
Because your kids were like 10, 11.
Yeah, well, mostly the oldest one, JC. The young ones, they didn't really know what was going on. JC's teacher ended up running in my last election where Peggy Wilson won. And so he would start every Friday with current events and take out the newspaper, and who's on the front page every day down in Ketchikan is me. And he would discuss me in front of my child. And that's tough. the editor of the newspaper's son was in JC's class at school. And he was no big fan. And he would sit at the dinner table and talk about me in a negative way. And then so his son brings that to school. And I pick my daughter up and she's teary. I'm like, what's going on? And she explains to me, so and so is talking about how his dad really, I don't know if the word hate is possible, but just negativity. And it was very difficult on my family. And that was the tough part. I can take it, but it was hard to see people that I loved go through things like that. And then all this was happening in the middle of redistricting. And so the Republican controlled redistricting board redistricted Peggy Wilson into my district. So now I'm running against Peggy, who's a wonderful, amazing person, but she'll do whatever she was told by the Republican Party, 100%. So you look at the political calculus they were doing. If we don't let him back in the caucus, he has to run against another incumbent, and we're going to support her 100%. And it was just, that's why I say that my screw up really gave them the world, because they had all this reason and ammunition to get rid of me, and I gave them a chance. But that's life. That's how it goes. And I have no regrets.
So Peggy Wilson, where did she live?
Wrangell.
Okay. And so they just swooped down and grabbed Ketchikan when they redistricted so that.
Yeah, well, Ketchikan swooped up and grabbed
Gotcha.
Wrangell. Wrangell used to be part of the Sitka district.
Got it.
Yeah. And it remains that way today. Wrangell is part of the district today.
Right.
And that's how it went. And Peggy, Peggy was going to retire until this thing at caucus happened. She had told everybody this was her last time around. We made her majority whip because she wanted to have
A leadership
position before she retired. And as soon as everything went sideways for me, they talked her into running again. And then she hired their choice, Sherry Klein, out of Ketchikan. Sherry came up and was Peggy's staff member for 2 years to learn the ropes. And then she filed for the open seat when Peggy retired. That's when Dan Ortez filed. And at that point, now I'm like, okay, Dan was my high school social studies teacher. He was my JV basketball coach, a guy that I admired a lot. And I thought he was hardworking and honest and really cared about Ketchikan. And I felt, not that Sherry wasn't, but I felt like she was more of a tool of the machine. I know her. We've known each other a long time. She's really nice. We're still friends. But that's when I went all in for Dan and tried to help him as much as possible over the last decade. To be honest, it felt good, almost like revenge against the machine that was against me. But Dan was no clown. He was a good representative. I thought he did a good job for Ketchikan. And he's representing my kids and my friends and family, and I want the best representation. That's why Jeremy Bynum just won. And he was my target for the last couple election cycles against Dan. I'd sat out this one. I didn't get involved because my guy wasn't in there. Mm-hmm. But that's politics. I'm going to have to knock on his door and say, hey, Jeremy, I've talked to people who know him, and I think he's receptive and understands the politics of it.
I have a couple more questions, and they're personal. You can answer them or not, but because it's in part of the reporting, and just did you get divorced because of what was happening at that time?
No, and that was one of the things that got caught up in the story. So in 2004, my twins were born. And so now we have 3 kids. And by 2008, we were drifting quite a bit apart, and we separated in 2008. And legally divorced, I think it was 2009. But that got mingled into the story as though that was a result of my political actions, which seeing that is difficult because that reflects on Michelle my ex-wife as well. And the kids now are a little bit older. And so they hear stuff in a small town. All separations and divorces are difficult. But neither one of us subjected our kids to that from us. We were united, even though we may have been arguing over email or on the phone. We never, ever stopped supporting each other in front of the kids. And we never really stopped supporting each other. There were emotions, of course, but for both of us, I think we were pretty mature about it. And we talked about being that way on behalf of our children. And so, yeah, that unfortunately was mischaracterized. Those are two completely separate events. And it just made things even more difficult because you can't explain that to someone who's upset when you're down at the grocery store and someone's yelling that at you. Are you going to sit down and explain your divorce to somebody? Come on.
Right. And not to dwell on it, but what were the people screaming at your mom? What were they saying to her?
How disappointed they were and how your son would do something like that. Doesn't he care about Ketchikan? He was majority leader and he had power. And they're just not random people. They're politicos, people who are really paying attention and they know what a majority leader is. They understand the power structure. And they were upset and they were mad at me. And they were just taking it out on her because, like I said, it's just 12,000 people on an island. Everybody knows everybody. I was on the front page giving my mom a hug the night that I won the initial election. So I think it was just, they couldn't get at me, so they just take a swing at her. Or the teacher, why he would go over things that were happening to me in my own daughter's class. That's a personality problem with him. Some people are mean. They didn't go after my dad because my dad was a pretty tough little guy and he didn't take guff off of anybody. But his buddies would tease him about it good-naturedly because it's a human thing. It's a human mistake. And some people accepted that and they could be humorous, which was fine. I had no problem with that. It was the mean-spirited folks who would see me in a bar having a beer and would come up to me and challenge me to come outside and things like that.
So I guess the second question I was going to ask is you moved to Hawaii. I don't know the timeline, but I guess like after the redistricting and running against another incumbent, just what was the timeline for leaving Alaska and the calculus behind that?
It was a number of things. My dad passed away in 2016, and I had a relationship with my dad that was unique, I think. I have an older brother who is more of an intellectual and more of a thinker in that sense. And my sister, my older sister, she's the middle child. She's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian, looks just like my dad. She's a special ed teacher. She taught up in the bush in Alaska for a long time. She retired out of the Anchorage School District. And she had moved over to Maui. And my parents have owned a little place over here since the mid-'80s. And my sister moved over here. She has two special needs sons, two autistic boys. And she was married to a pilot. And they separated, and she wanted a place where she could take care of her boys. So she was living over here. My dad passed away. And as I said, we were very close because my brother and sister left Ketchikan right after graduation of high school and never really came back. And so I came back because I loved living there. And my dad and I both played basketball in high school. We both had lots of friends. We both liked to have a beer and have fun. And so we were very similar people. And living there in the same town as him, we just continued to grow closer. When he passed away, it was really difficult for me. Nothing's ever really been the same. And so she lived way up on the side of the hill. And now she's by herself in this house.
Your mom.
Yeah. And so she couldn't walk down to get the mail if it was snowy. It was just too dangerous. And so she got tired of that. And without my dad there, she decided to sell her house in Ketchikan and move into the condo that they owned here in Maui. And so now my dad's gone. My mom has moved off and my sister lives over here. My kids are in high school and they're very independent. And every single time I would go out in public, even 6, 7 years after the fact, I would be challenged. Literally, people would come up to me and still continue to harp on me about politics. I'm working as an eligibility technician for Department of Public Assistance, processing food stamps. That's what I'm doing at the time. And people harass me about what happened. And I'd say, listen, I don't do that anymore. And it never stopped. It would never stop. And it was difficult because I applied for many jobs in Ketchikan and I wouldn't get jobs. And after the job interviews, there's usually 2 or 3 people in a job interview, at least the ones that I was in. One of those persons would come up and say, we really wanted to hire you, but so-and-so didn't feel like it was good for us to have you on staff here because of all the baggage. Small town, it's difficult. And so I was just feeling really actually down about the whole situation.
Kyle, I get that Ketchikan's small, but is it because of the accusations that you had an affair? Was that like part of it, or was it just the political stuff?
It was a combination, but really it was the letdown of the politics side of it because they believed in me so much as a locally grown person who was doing a great job as a representative. We built $50 million intertie that had been stalled for years. That was accomplished under my watch. The Marine Highway was in a shambles at the time, and I had public meetings in Ketchikan, and people were so happy about the results that we were getting. We were doing great things with a great staff, and people were excited and supportive. When I was supported, the town was incredible. They were all extremely supportive. And then I go off and make a huge mistake and they're disappointed.
And they can't forgive you. Yeah, years later.
Still years later, yeah. And I understand to a point the disappointment. A year ago, I had a guy called me up out of the blue here in Maui, got my phone number, called me and was literally crying on the phone. I believed in you. I believed in you. I'm like, okay. And he was an acquaintance, not a friend. But I think, yeah, some people were upset about my personal life. But a lot of people were upset because they were disappointed in my possibilities as a professional. And I get both. I understand both motivations for negativity.
So you moved to Hawaii when your mom moved to Hawaii?
No, she was here for a while, and I was not having a good time in Ketchikan, and my sister was having a challenging time with her 2 sons, and I wanted to change, and I didn't know what else to do. And I love Maui. I've been coming over here, like I said, since 1985. I've been coming over here. It's really a second home for our family, and it has a lot of similarities to Alaska with the extremely strong indigenous population, very similar things like that. And I just thought I'd give it a chance, give it a shot, come over here. And within a year, COVID hit and the whole place was shut down. And I spent a lot of time working on my brain, on myself. I'm not afraid to say I think it's very healthy to share the fact that I went and got mental health. I went to a therapist and worked these issues out of my brain that would repeat over and over again of how I did things wrong and what people said to me and how I made people I respect feel and how mean people were treating me, everything that goes over in your brain a million times when you're trying to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I think that's important for people to be okay with, especially for men. It's a big challenge for men in particular to say, I need help. And it's not because I have a broken arm. It's because I need help with my feelings and my emotions. And so being over here, being away from constant negativity that was occurring in Ketchikan really helped me work on my personal mental health. And only time heals, and that's why I'm coming back to Alaska, because I feel strong, which wasn't the case a few years ago. And not putting myself back into the Ketchikan environment, even though I love that town and always will. I don't want to live there and deal with that because that will never go away. It's just not healthy. But I love Alaska so much, and I want to be a part of the decision-making process for the structure that my kids and ultimately probably grandkids will have to live under, these laws that you and others are passing. And I
Well,
want to be a part of that.
I wanted to just say I'm so grateful that you're going to be my staff. I'm sure that people have questions, though, about former Republican majority leader going to work for a Democrat from Anchorage. This is your chance to explain why.
I can tell you that I listened to Liesel's podcast this morning. And
Liesl McGuire, former senator, former House member, former House Judiciary Chair.
Liesel was counsel to Brian Porter's Judiciary Committee when I was first in the building. So 1996, we were on the same floor. We were in resources and she was in judiciary. So she's one of the first people that I met. She's wonderful. And as she said, she was a Republican because her dad was a Republican. I was a Republican for a different reason. When I went to work for Bill being a Democrat, I was not affiliated with anything. And I registered as a Republican so I could go to Republican meetings and sit in with the Republicans and know what they were doing. Pete Eklund, the other local staff member, wasn't part of any party. And so for me, it was strategic, 100%. I wanted to sit in those meetings and find out what they were talking about. And in those days, to run, if you weren't established like Bill was, being a Republican was the easiest way to win. And so I was a Republican for those 6 years. And after I left office, I switched to undeclared immediately. And so philosophically, I was always a moderate and always appreciating people who were looking to solve problems and get things done. That's what Bill did. That's what I felt like I did. And we didn't know each other. I watched the legislature religiously, and people who are trying to get things done stand out to me. And you were one of the people that stood out to me as someone who was trying to accomplish good things for people, not necessarily for any group or party. And so I was a fan before we ever communicated. And so it's easy for me to ignore party labels and to look at the person and what they're about and how they try and accomplish things. And so that's the explanation.
Kyle Johansen, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
I'm dropping a link to Charisse Millett's podcast episode and to Liesl McGuire's podcast episode in the show notes. Thank you, listeners. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.